Good evening. Mr. Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C. We're in the interval now between the Republican convention, which has concluded, and the beginning of the Democratic convention that will start on Monday. And we will, of course, have something to say about Hillary Clinton's vice presidential pick, Tim Kaine. But now let's look back on the Republican convention and try to get an estimate of the existential threat that this Republican ticket now, the Truppence ticket, we ought to coin a phrase that the Truppence is not worth an halfpenny anymore. So 3 pence, not even worth half a penny with these characters. It's going to be very ugly. So what we're looking at is a convention which has marked a turning point in U.S. Political life, and for ill. The convention, of course, was an exercise in brainwashing, in hysteria, in the big lie, and it was populated by scoundrels. What can you say? And the top scoundrel is Trump, an expert in fear-mongering, an expert in psychological suggestion, all of these techniques not really learned as a science, but as a con artist, as a salesman, trying to size up people and see what their weaknesses are. And he's obviously been able to do that now for crowds. The convention was a complete flim-flam and letdown and disappointment for anybody who thought that there would be anything concrete about economic program. They were, of course, completely let down. There was nothing concrete about economic program. The economic program is being done in the background that we know by Larry Kudlow, friend Steve Moore of the Wall Street Journal, or think tanks now, I guess, and by none other than Art Laffer, the Philistine with the most arid banality. Art Laffer came up with the Laffer curve, and that was fed into the circles of Ronald Reagan, and they said, well, of course, if you cut taxes, then you're going to increase your tax revenue because so much wonderful business activity will proliferate. And with that, Reagan tripled the U.S. national debt. But of course, you wouldn't hear anything about that at the convention. There was no mention of Wall Street. There was no mention of the Federal Reserve. There was no mention of income inequality. There was no mention of the fact that the American standard of living has declined by 1/2 to 2/3, depending on where you live and what your job is and some other factors. U.S. standard of living declined by 1/2 to 2/3 about 1967 to 71. Different estimates in there too. There was nothing about a high-tech exports campaign to try to solve the question of the merchandise trade deficit, which was also not really mentioned in any serious way. So it was a complete tissue of racist, obscurantist slogans, a disgusting blot on American history. But now here's the big thing. All the commentators, or many of them, are noting how dark it was, how pessimistic, how lugubrious and shadowy the world seemed, right? It's the dark convention, the darkling plane, new dark age, it's all that. But specifically what it is, with this convention, the Republican Party has switched from its traditional direct apologetic and has switched over to the indirect apologetic. And this is an important milestone. The direct apologetic is the rhetoric of the Chamber of Commerce of the Republican Party up until recently. And it essentially says, there are no problems. Capitalism, finance capital is working great. Everything is being solved. There may be some minor problems left, but they're in the course of being solved. So essentially, the problems have been defeated. there's only a residue of the problem. So onward and upward and boosterism all the way, and American exceptionalism, of course, and the greatest engine for prosperity in the history of the world, and all of these idiotic cliches. Now, the problem with the direct apologetic is it begins to break down when things get really bad. And when you've lost 1/2 to 1/3 of your living standard, then things are bad. So at that point, the direct apologetic really doesn't work very well. At that point, you have to shift to the indirect apologetic. And this is Trump. Instead of denying these horrendous problems of poverty, of unemployment, of terrorism, of war, and all the rest of these things, the indirect apologetic starts from them. It says, yes, there is war, there is terrorism, there's economic breakdown, there are declining standards of living, and so forth. But these are portrayed not so much as the product of a system or of previous decisions that went bad. They are portrayed more or less as the human condition. That is pretty much the way things are. And at that point, you need a strongman. In other words, precisely since the world is this darkling plain with terrorism and war and enemies and poverty and the terrible balance of payments and greedy adversaries dumping products and so forth. Precisely for this reason, you need a dictator, you need a strongman. For those of you who are interested in the technical, philosophical aspects of this, the transition from the direct apologetic of various British writers, it goes over then to the German school, and in particular, Schopenhauer is often considered the inventor of the indirect apologetic, and Nietzsche is one of the great practitioners. But then the entire fascist movements start with this whole world and then recommend social Darwinism, brutality, cutthroat tactics as a means of somehow dealing with it. So that's what they're calling dark. The transition from the direct apologetic, Chamber of Commerce, rah-rah, boosterism, everything's great, and read Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. The transition from that to the indirect apologetic, which essentially says, this is the human condition, this is the veil of tears, we need a strong man to help us out. Now, remember, Trump got a minority of the votes in the Republican primary. He got 47% of the votes in the entire primary. So people came out to vote for him. They came out in slightly larger numbers to vote against him. So don't think he's invulnerable. He's not. He has feet of clay, for sure. And of course, the 721 votes against him point to the fact that he's done the worst job since Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford, look at all the weaknesses he had. The pardon to Nixon, the fact of being the first a president who was not elected in any way, right? Not elected president, not elected vice president. So all of those things point to weaknesses for Trump. Now, I want to remind you, Trump is not a nationalist. What Trump proposes is essentially causing civil war here in the United States. He's as big a nationalist as Jefferson Davis or Alexander Stevens or Robert Toombs or the rest of these Confederate slave-driving leaders. He is in their school, not the Abraham Lincoln school. He is a racist, he's a nativist, and we'll get some other choice views on him in just a minute. There is something new here, taking over an existing party. Most fascists, Mussolini, Hitler, have had to build their own party. How about the Republican Party of the United States, after so many decades of degradation, starting with Nixon, essentially, then coming over to be a fascist party now? Because it's Trump fascism, as we've been saying for months, if he imposes that on the Republican Party, why then they become fascist too. The obvious note of the convention is plebeians, right? Petty bourgeois, Babbitts, Poujadistes, who want to express their contempt for the existing elites. They want to act out. But of course, that won't put your kid through college. That won't pay for your wife's operation. That won't do a dozen other things that you need done. It's only a kind of a consolation prize. And you notice how narrowly Trump defines those elites. It's only political elites. It's nobody else. Maybe sometimes entertainment elites, right? Maybe Rosie O'Donnell. But that's even farther from anything relevant to the plight of a working family. He never talks about Wall Street. He never talks about generals. He could say, we have generals who are incompetent, right? As Clemenceau said, war is much too important to be left to these stupid generals. Well, not Trump. He could attack university presidents. He could say, you're politically correct and you should be fired. He doesn't really do that. He only focuses on these pathetic running dogs who are these politicians, right? Who are hired and fired and bought and sold. His son, Eric, said, my dad can't be bought or sold, intimidated. But of course, he forgot to mention that he can be rented or leased. Pathetic politicians. And that's the fascist concept. The fascists want to direct all the resentment in the society against the politicians, thereby leaving the bankers as unscathed as possible. Not always completely unscathed, but as much as possible. Now, let's not waste time analyzing the retrospect now of this monstrous Republican convention. The point is to defeat them. The point is to drive them back. Now, we need, first of all, economic program, the one thing that they didn't discuss. So the point is, if you want to get out of a depression where your living standard has gone down 1/2 to 2/3, your social mobility is now worse than any country except Great Britain, and that's really bad. Some ideas now. It's going to be important to campaign for the seizing of the Fed. People who sold their souls to Bernie Sanders, unfortunately, have been left with a rather meager program, a very timid reformism, a very timid kind of social democratic approach. The Tax Wall Street Party calls on whoever becomes president, but in this campaign, whoever is willing to take up this challenge, take control of the Federal Reserve, seize the Federal Reserve, force them to issue $1.5 trillion of 0% multi-decade credit to everybody who has a student loan. Essentially freeze this immense burden on the millennials and on the younger generation, which has stopped their lives in their tracks. Right? These are cases of arrested development now because they can't find places to live, get married, have children, and go through the essentials of social reproduction, which is what those are. So those have to be resumed at all costs. Therefore, the Federal Reserve must step up to the plate, no longer serving as a central bank of the bankers, by the bankers, and for the bankers, but rather as an institution using the public credit, because it is public, not privatizing it, but putting it at the service of the entire economy and the entire society. You obviously need a 1% Wall Street sales tax, and that should be used then to fund another 10 million jobs. Right? The first tranches of public credit, in this case Treasury credit, have to be used to put the 10 million people in the inner cities and rural America back to work, or more importantly, get them to work for the first time. The Marion Barry Memorial Program of job creation. And it also goes back to the PWA, WPA, and other institutions. When seizing the Fed, we don't want to just have the 1.5 trillion for the student loans. We're going to need 5 trillion for infrastructure, the rebuilding of the entire American junkyard, the post-industrial crater in our moonscape has got to be refurbished in every way. 30 million new productive jobs will emerge, and that stimulus will, along with other measures, put the economy out of this depression and into positive development. Concerning Trump on tariffs and protection, all talk, no cattle. Talk's a good game, delivers nothing. If you want to do something to protect the U.S. economy, start with a 15% tariff. Call it a protective tariff. It's not that big, but it will do the job. And that will be a 15% tariff as a general protection against dumping and other nefarious activities. The other thing, of course, is for any candidate, there's got to be a declaration, which we haven't heard from Trump and which we demand to hear from Hillary Clinton. No military actions can be taken past this point without a congressional declaration of war. We've strayed from this path long enough. We've got to go back to the method that the Constitution prescribes. Unless you're being attacked, unless somebody's crossing your border in arms and shooting and killing, there's got to be a congressional vote. Both houses have to approve war. These Republican hypocrites, of course, say Obama should declare war. That was Trump. Obama should declare war. Obama has been trying to get the Congress to pass some kind of legal authority for what he's doing in Syria and probably, again, Iraq now. But they haven't been willing to do it. So there's a lot of lying going on there. The other thing that's necessary is that the Democrats are going to have to contemplate some muscular tactics. In other words, Obama, get tough. Very hard for him to do, I know. For example, Harry Truman in 1948 at the Democratic Convention called the Congress back for a special session. And that means he called them back and he proposed legislation and they had to debate it and vote on it. I would call the Congress back and say, if we had somebody tough, we could say, why don't you raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour? And think about that as a measure to cool off the inner cities at a time of great economic hardship and great tension and potential violence. Cool off those cities. Call the Congress back and present them with a bunch of things, and then demand Trump to take a binding position, not a throwaway line, not some quip of the kind that he likes to throw around, but a binding position that will bind him to a point of view. Get him, pound him down, get him on record to that extent. Now, the other thing, of course, about Trump, the Democrats have still not come up with a way to deal with Trump. They're not fighting him effectively. They are too weak, obviously, because the Democrats can't do radical things. If you attack Trump as a stooge and puppet of Wall Street, well, then you do have to deal with the fact that Hillary Clinton is also largely a stooge and puppet of Wall Street. So you can see why. She's structurally very weak. It's probably going to be necessary for people in publishing and journalism and the media to take this up. I would point to an example. Someone who has merited something important for the United States in the past week is this author, his name being Schwartz. Tony Schwartz, who worked for New York Magazine then, was the ghostwriter of Trump's ghost-written book, The Art of the Deal. And this guy has now fallen into contrition. He's horrified by what he's done. That's good. He has confessed his sins. That's good too. And he is also trying now to make restitution. He goes on TV and he says, not only does this person have a 2-minute attention span, this person, if he gets his hands on the nuclear codes, is likely to launch war, probably over some stupid verbal slight or being dissed at the infantile level where stupid Trump operates, and cause the end of civilization as we've known it. Those little stubby fingers reaching for the nuclear button. That is the theme. Why not go back and reissue the Johnson 1964 Daisies ad, which showed the little girl picking the petals off a flower, and then by the time we get to the end, the thermonuclear fireball emerges.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
You've got to think about that, because if Goldwater was a madman who brought the threat of World War III, I would say Trump is 10 times the madman and 10 times the threat of World War III. Also because the people that were organized to try to fight against nuclear holocaust back in the 1950s are simply no longer organized to do that. So you know the general outlines, right? Trump is a psychotic. Senator Gordon Humphrey said he is a sick sociopath. He's a psychopath. He's mentally ill. And we've just heard from Mr. Schwartz, the author of this extremely interesting retrospective on his interactions with Trump. He's telling you that he's crazy and he's going to start World War III and he's going to end civilization. And that means you. So don't take this lying down. It is no laughing matter. It is deadly serious. It is life or death. Go see one of those movies, The Day After or whatever it is, and contemplate, do you want to put yourself in a position where Trump's stubby fingers are going to inflict that on you? So he is a psychotic. I will be developing and further developing the 10, count them, 10 psychopathic syndromes which we have identified with Trump, right? And you can see this on my website of tarpley.net because that's where you find the tape of the presentation I made of this at the Left Forum in New York City on Saturday, the 21st of May, I believe. And this entire theme needs to be much further developed. The obvious other one is fascism. A lot of people have come around to fascism now, having seen the Republican convention. I think in this regard, it was probably the Tuesday afternoon when the Trump roll call vote took place, when the chair, the podium, the Priebus people, refused to count the votes as they were given. So this was a kind of an Orwellian doublethink vote. You could see the split in the Republican Party. There was one vote count on the podium with the creatures of Priebus and Trump and Manafort, and then down in the swamp with the poor delegates, there was another one, which they had labored on at their state convention, but that was not allowed to stand up. The other question with Trump, of course, is that he's a thief. He's a mafioso. Remember, the families, right? The mafia, Gambino, Genovese, Bonanno, Lucchese, Colombo, Trump. They're all sitting there in the same pea pod. So you cannot consider representatives of the Trump campaign as normal people in a normal society. Remember, whether they're mercenaries or not, they are attempting to destroy the institutions that we have built the Constitution, the tradition of democratic freedoms, and limited government. That's included too. You cannot be jailed. There's got to be habeas corpus unless there's civil war and things of this sort. First Amendment. Trump wants to take your free speech away by being able to sue you. Fifth Amendment. He wants to drag you out of your bed at night, say, look, Buster, you're an illegal alien, out you go. And no judge, no trial, no due process. 14th Amendment, he wants to abolish the famous jus soli, that if you're born here, you're a citizen. And that's one of the things the Union Army fought for in the Civil War. Obviously, Trump not involved. So polite society actually requires that you ostracize, expel, humiliate, disgrace, degrade people who support this monstrosity. The society has to defend itself with its own immune system and immune mechanisms. Those people are using democratic forms to destroy constitutional government. Now, a couple of other things about the Nazi angle, which I regard as being extremely critical. The first is Reince Priebus. He's now a big ally of Trump, right? Trump is the establishment now. The establishment of the Republican Party as of today is Reince Priebus and Donald Trump, with Manafort and a few other of these myrmidons involved. That's a very ugly bureaucracy for you to see. When we look at Priebus and his speech, we notice something very strange. In this convention, Priebus has told the story of a man called William Knudsen. Knudsen was the president of General Motors in 1940 and 1941. And Priebus has now developed a habit of telling the story of this wonderful Knudsen. He did it I think he did it at the Republican National Committee winter meeting here in Washington back at the beginning of the year in January and February. So he tells the story of Knudsen. He's like a wonderful story of American service. Now, Knudsen was a Nazi sympathizer. Knudsen was somebody who vastly admired Hitler and who journeyed to the Reich in order to view the new Germany as created by Hitler. And after he saw it, he was interviewed by the New York Times when he got back to New York, and he said, Hitler's Germany is the miracle of the 20th century. Now, his contacts with Hitler and Goering and others, those were not just mutual admiration, but it's got to do with the fact that General Motors had large automobile plants, I think they still do, in Germany, right? Opel, Rüsselsheim, different plants. That one's in the Frankfurt area. Knudsen was involved in building a factory near Berlin for the most advanced aircraft for the Luftwaffe. It has been said that the Nazis rode to war on General Motors wheels. In other words, the vehicles that took the Wehrmacht into Poland and France and the Soviet Union. A lot of those were General Motors vehicles, because that's the kind of guy Knudsen was. And notice, when it came to serving the American military, Knudsen dragged his feet. He said, oh no, let's have another year of civilian automobile production. It's not fair to Mr. and Mrs. America that they can't get a new roadster just because of what's happening in Europe and the Far East. Well, this is the kind of sabotage that was carried out by people who were fascist sympathizers and indeed Nazi sympathizers in the critical 39 to 41 or 42 period. Knudsen was $1 a year man, and Priebus thinks that's a wonderful thing. The problem with that is $1 a year man meant an employee, an executive of a company run by a reactionary boss, quite often, say Ford That was another really bad one. Henry Ford, of course, pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi, all the rest. He would send his people into the federal government as $1 a year men. It meant an executive who was serving for a token $1 a year, otherwise not getting paid. But of course, what those people did was to go into the government and skew and distort and misalign the key choices. And in particular, well, are you going to have unions? You're going to have decent wages? What are your work rules going to be? Those $1 a year men were essentially lobbyists who had been taken into the government in order to influence what was going on in the war mobilization. Take a look at Bruce Catton's book, The Warlords of Washington, and you get some idea, right? Bruce Catton, famous Civil War historian, but in the 1940s he wrote this other book, The Warlords of Washington. So why does the chairman of the Republican Party of the United States in this day and age go around telling the story of a Nazi sympathizer whose main achievement was to produce plenty for Hitler and to sabotage production for the United States? I find this strange, and it meshes, of course, with the theme that the Tax Wall Street Party has been putting out. Trump equals Nazi. Knudsen is very, very much in this category. Also notice, we're told that Trump's success in the election depends on the Rust Belt, right, of the Midwest, from Western Pennsylvania through Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, places like this. Here's the problem with that. In terms of the attitude towards Hitler in that critical time of 1940 to 41, the general rundown was this. The Northeast, Wall Street, Boston, Philadelphia, were pro-British because they had financial dealings with the British and they wanted the British to prosper and thrive, so they would get paid. That's one region. Second region is the American South. They're pro-British because of the Episcopal Anglican Church, of which the Queen is the head, the king at that point, right? King George VI, I guess. But the Midwest is the area where heavy industrialists, be they Knudsen or Henry Ford or others, were looking at Hitler with great sympathy. And we now strangely find that the progeny of those executives, right, be they GM, Chrysler, Ford executives, and so forth, those families are still there, make no mistake. And now that's where Trump is hoping to do well. So what you're seeing is some pretty chilling stuff. Now, the other one that's interesting, I think, is something that comes from, I guess, Ken Burns, who does these series for the PBS network, and he's popularized, I guess, the phrase Vichy Republican, Vichy. Now, in terms of our propaganda, we're well aware of Vichy. There's a very good book by Henri Guillemin about Pétain and his whole career and what French fascism looked like, because that's what it is. But most people don't know this. So when we started trying to make the American people aware of Trump as a fascist and a Nazi, we didn't start with Pétain because these comparisons are known to very few. Although the word, of course, is still not good. Most people know who Hitler was. Many sometimes know who Mussolini was, but Pétain, not so much. Probably Franco of Spain is better known than Pétain. But the point about this is, Ken Burns is saying that the Republican leaders are like the politicians of Vichy France. That is, once you're more or less occupied by Hitler, not completely, but partly, then you go along, right? You play ball, go along to get along, and join the Vichy regime. And lots and lots of French did after the critical defeats around May 20th, 1940, the collapse of the French government, shortly after June 10th of 1940. But the Vichy regime is a very interesting one. It shows us some comparisons to Trump. We have called people's attention, as you may have noticed, to the fact that immigration and the desire to exclude certain groups played a role in the coming of Vichy fascism. And in those days, it was primarily Jews from Poland, from Russia, from Eastern Europe who wanted to come to France, and they were opposed by French aristocratic, reactionary, monarchist, anti-republican circles because they said those people are all communists. If you get a Polish Jew, he's likely to be a communist. Similar to Trump, not so different. So that was an issue that stoked the fascist movements, right? The Colonel de la Roque and others in France in the 1930s and got them going. The immigration issue, therefore, was key. Now, notice, then as now, those powerful evil forces and wealthy forces who control the news media, they don't want you to think about economics. They don't want you to remember that you've lost half of your standard of living and that your complaints, your beef starts with that. No, they don't want that. They want you to think that the Mexican immigrant or other terrified, super exploited people, that those are your real enemies. And it's such a bunch of baloney. But there is a depression, a depression here in the U.S., and we have had a decline of almost 2/3 in the standard of living. But here's what happened with the Vichy. On July 10th, 1940, and most people don't know this stuff, with Nazi Germany occupying maybe a half to 2/3 of France, but the southern part considered less important, not occupied, but run by this Vichy government, who also control Algeria and some French colonies, which and some of them quite important, and a fleet. What happens then is Pétain and his right-hand man Laval say, look, we need you deputies to vote emergency powers to Pétain. July 10th, 1940. Not July 14th, but July 10th, 1940, in a theater, in the opera casino of Vichy, which is a resort in the sense of, like Saratoga Springs, healthful waters, things like this. So at that point, there's not a majority. There's not a quorum of the French National Assembly on hand to do it, but they simply do it with the people that they've got. And that, I'm wondering, is that something that Trump has in mind? In other words, does the Vichy Republicans go further than we think? Well, on July 17th, right, 7 days after the rump of the French National Assembly had somehow voted to create this emergency dictatorship, all power to Marshal Pétain. And it means that you even changed the name of the country. Instead of République Française, French Republic, it becomes État Français, French state, no republic. Sinister, not so good. If Trump tries to change the name of the United States, we have to watch out. On July 17th, very early on, right, one of the first things, they passed a law, so-called, saying that if you wanted to be an official of the French state, you had to have a father who was also born in France. So, nativism, just like Trump. So the Vichy connection is actually interesting. And one of the things you see with this is when you're looking for parallels to U.S. politics in Europe, don't think of the British first. Think of France, especially during the times when it's a republic. U.S. is a republic, France is a republic. This establishes some important similarities, and those are the ones you have to look at. Then, after passing the law that says if you want to be a government official, you've got to prove that your father was born in France. The next one is to say naturalizations. In other words, people who got citizenship after 1927 had better watch out because they may have their citizenship taken away. How about that? So you could have Trump saying, oh, as a good Vichy dictator, I want to go back and revisit these people who have gotten citizenship because maybe they don't deserve it, right? Maybe we should kick them out. And then in October of 1940, they already got their anti-Semitic laws. So, then of course, before too long, the Vichy legislation included banning of unions, outlawing strikes, and other repressive measures designed to drive down the wages because at that point, the Vichy economy was functioning as a kind of subset of the Nazi war economy in Germany, and that involves workers as well as production inside of what had been France. So the Vichy Republicans, what can we say about a party where the chairman of the party is praising the work of the Danish immigrant but pro-Nazi theoretician William Knudsen, and then of the Vichy Republicans, who have so many parallels because they're all about immigration and related issues. So this has been Webster Tarpley from Washington, D.C. Between the conventions. Keep up with us next week on tarpley.net and the Tax Wall Street Party, and we'll see you soon.